So much of this was on the record. It wasn't like I was making allegations of things where I couldn't point directly to the citation for where I got it. The other part of that was the bizarre arguments I found myself having where people were going, yeah, I said that, but that's not what I meant, even though I said it multiple times. And suddenly I was going, wait, what? Because I thought the argument was going to be like, hey, there's nothing wrong with what I said, or I think you're making a big deal out of nothing. But that was not what it ended up being.
You're listening to Faith in Action. I'm your host, Matthew Nowlin.
And I'm Sean Graham.
We lead Conservative Christians of Tennessee, and we're thankful you're joining us today. Conservative Christians of Tennessee exists to analyze political policy and politicians in Tennessee, and all from a conservative Christian worldview. We want to glorify God by helping you to glorify God, so please don't hesitate to send us any questions or comments via email. You can reach me directly by emailing matthew@tnchristian.com
or Sean at tnchristian.com.
Today's show is brought to you in the Memphis area by Herbie Systems. Give Herbie Systems a call at 901-451-8214 for all your lawn care needs. Since 1984, Herbie Systems has been the premier lawn care and landscape company in the Mid-South. So give Herbie Systems a call today. That's 901-451-8214, or visit herbiesystems.com and let them kill your weeds. Today's scriptures are from 1 Corinthians 5:11 through 13. But now I have written unto you not to keep company, if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner. With such an one, no, not to eat. For what have I to do to judge them also that are without? Do ye not judge them that are within? But them that are without God judgeth. Therefore put away from among yourselves that wicked person. Listeners, today we're happy to talk with a friend that we introduced you to last December. And, it's like the cool friend that you act like you introduced you to. You guys probably already knew her, but our conversation with her fits perfectly with our celebration of 5 years of broadcasting Christian worldview-focused shows on Faith in Action. All year we've been pointing to conversations we've covered in the past. We've been talking about general culture becoming woke, churches becoming woke, political issues. If you remember, we're the first radio show we know of in Tennessee that even addressed the topic of critical race theory. But if you haven't picked up the pattern yet, we tend to repeat ourselves often. It's because when we see an issue, we want to hit it hard. That's because most of the issues we've been calling attention to for the past 5 years are still really big problems, like critical theory. We've got like a handle on this just for now, but man, there's a lot of seeds germinating. So churches and denominations, they're still acting cowardly. They're drifting ever leftward away from biblical teachings. Culture is a disaster. Nobody knows what bathrooms to use. And politics, well, sometimes we see some things that we want to call wins, but these isolated wins generally fall short of our needs. And sometimes it feels more like the gambling addict who just gets the cha-ching they need to keep going. The need for our nation is to repent and return to our Christian governing principles for the betterment of our land and for the spiritual health of our children. So at Faith in Action, we're not going to change our attack. We're not going to stop beating the drum on these issues. We've heard from you and listeners around Tennessee. We plan to make sure that we continue speaking even louder as we go forward. We'll continue to find ways for our listeners to hear from great guests that can provide Christian insights into matters at hand. And we'll continue to ask you to jump in and put your faith into action. We'll continue to share what the Lord leads us to. And now we will ask you to do your part. Pray, study, and get ready, because we all need to be fighting for the cause of Christ as we head towards 2025. And I was so encouraged after last week's show where we asked you to consider running for office at all the emails that I got. If I haven't gotten back to you, it's because I haven't had time. I got so many. So as we head towards 2025 and the blessed thought that we all get to stand for Christ every day anew, we're going to welcome our guest, Megan Basham. She's a New York Times best-selling author. She's a culture reporter with the Daily Wire, where she contributes regularly to the top 10 news podcast Morning Wire. And for 13 years, she wrote for World Magazine, where she rose from a film critic to entertainment editor and co-host of its flagship top 50 news podcast, The World and Everything in It. You've seen her work on all the major cable outlets and in places like the Wall Street Journal, the Telegraph, National Review, the Today Show, and so many others. She's the author of Beside Every Successful Man from 2008. And this year, she released Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. She lives in Charlotte, North Carolina with her husband, Brian, and their 2 daughters. Welcome back to Faith in Action, Megan Basham.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's good to be here. It's always nice to hang with friends you know in real life because it's so much more relaxed and casual.
And you guys lived in Memphis for a while. We talked about that on the last show.
Yeah.
But the thing that is different rather now, is you were not a superstar New York Times best-selling author. Are they just trying to get conservatives on their bestseller list, Megan, so that Donald Trump will stop calling them the failing New York Times? No, the
I'm
book is
actually
very
going to
good.
tell you, it was the opposite. As a conservative, you have to do so well to actually get them to acknowledge you. My colleague, Michael Knowles, by all due rights, should have been on the list for one of his books, didn't make it. I hear that from conservative writers all the time. And in fact, my editor said, do not expect to make the list, even if the raw sales show that you should be on it, because they very frequently will snub conservatives. But I will say, thankfully, we sold so many that they could not credibly ignore it. So that was a blessing and a nice surprise.
It was fun to watch it.
Too big
Yeah,
to
the
ignore.
numbers were fabulously huge. And it was so shocking when it came out. I was like, oh, maybe it'll trickle and do this, that. It went nuts. And it
Yeah,
was just
I didn't
amazing.
expect it. Yeah, I mean, I kind of thought it was sort of a niche topic for people like us. But, I think a lot of people, even people who are not necessarily super involved in their church, in their local ministry, I think they have been seeing the trickle down effects for a while. So even those kind of people were interested in I have sensed that some of these well-known pastors have been saying things that certainly don't align with the church I grew up in. And so I think even people like that wanted to know, what is going on? Why is that happening?
What are the demographics? I mean, I'm just curious, who's reading this book?
That's a really good question. And I don't know. It's not like exit polls where I can go, okay, I know that we sold this many books to millennials, this many books. I do suspect that a lot of older readers bought the book.
Mhm.
One, because they buy books. And two, because let me tell you, an appearance on the Mike Huckabee show moves books.
Yeah.
I had no idea. I went on Mike Huckabee's show and wasn't really paying attention to the sales that weekend. And my agent called me on Monday and went, did you do some media this weekend? Because the book went nuts. And I went, no, I just did Mike Huckabee's show. And so that guy moves some books.
In the South,
Yeah,
you just
yeah.
have to have a musically talented politician type guy, and we embrace them around here.
Since having that bestseller, how has that changed things for you?
It has opened a lot of doors. It also brought a lot of controversy that I don't think would have come if the
Yeah.
book had not been successful. I think probably the initial plan from some of the people that I write about in the book, people like J.D. Greer, Russell Moore, David French, people like that, I think probably their thinking was cone of silence defense. We will just pretend that she is, not really worth responding to. And then I think it hit the bestseller list, and that kind of went right out the window. So then it became sort of a flood of reviews from people who are associated with those guys, whether it was at places that they work or in their close circles at church or things like that. So I think that, one, I didn't expect it to be as controversial as it was, because to me, so much of this was on the record. It wasn't like I was making allegations of things where I couldn't point directly to the citation for where I got it. And, the other part of that was the bizarre arguments I found myself having where people were going, I said that, but that's not what I meant, even though I said it multiple times. And suddenly I was going, wait, what? Because I thought the argument was going to be like, hey, there's nothing wrong with what I said, or I think you're making a big deal out of nothing. But that was not what it ended up being. It was suddenly people trying to deny that they had done what they'd done at all.
Yeah, and that's crazy to me. Every year around Thanksgiving, it seems like we have John Badler from Mid-America over, and we talk about a psychological phenomenon, how to talk to your family at Thanksgiving. And a couple of years ago, we did one on gaslighting, the relatively new phenomenon of gaslighting. And man, for that being a thing that wasn't a thing a decade ago, there's been so much gaslighting around this book. Like,
I'm impressed with all the things she's written that she never wrote. It's been fun to watch, with all the claims they've made about her. It's like, where did that come from? I read the book. I literally have gone back and looked through the reference several times for things that people say. I'm like, that's not in there. Those words are not there anywhere. I mean, you put a lot of work into that. The footnotes alone, there's like 70 pages or something. It was nuts.
Yeah, that was intentional. So that I would be able to go, look, I show my work as much as I possibly can.
It was good. Yeah. And I'm very disappointed that people are doing that to you. It's not a godly testimony for people in our industry to be acting that way.
Well, and I will say, though, on the flip side, the people who have stepped up and had my back and sort of refused to back down when cancellation mob might be putting it too strongly, but people who are sort of using the evangelical friendship network to try to pressure them to back away and refused, people like Alisa Childers, she shut that down really quickly and went, no, I've reviewed what Megan said and I've reviewed what your complaint is. And I think she was right. People like Frank Turek did that, Rosaria Butterfield. So, you know, they say that a brother is made for adversity. So I have had the blessing of discovering I actually have a lot of brothers and sisters there who are willing to stand with me in it.
Awesome. Megan, what is the central premise of this book? Because I want to make sure that our listeners know if this is something that they would be interested in or not.
So a good way to get into the premise of it is to describe some of the controversy that came out over the title. So the title, Shepherds for Sale, I took that initially from a George Soros funded think tank called New America. And they had issued a report in 2015 where they talked about how they were going to, now these are not Christians, these are left-wing funded, secular group. In particular, they cited the Southern Baptist Convention, how they plan to infiltrate the Southern Baptist Convention in order to harness the power of the evangelical leaders in the SBC in the hopes that their influence would then trickle down to the average person in the pews for the cause of climate change policy, for specific policies. At that time, it was cap and trade. So in an interview about this report that one of the authors from this secular think tank wrote, a woman named Lydia Bean, she likened it to a rent a general model, which if you've ever heard about that, it's essentially when they would trot out a member of the military to go on CNN and sell some, piece of military policy, foreign policy to the public. And they were saying, we're going to do that with these evangelicals. And they called it the rent an evangelical model. So based on that, my editors and I kicked around the idea, well, maybe we just call it Evangelicals for Rent. And when we workshopped that, a lot of friends went, oh, that's kind of clunky and confusing. So that was kind of how we arrived at Shepherds for Sale. But, to me, it's very obvious that someone being for sale can have different layers of meaning. It can be both literal, which I cover a lot of, literal examples of left-wing power brokers buying influence from evangelical leaders, but it can also be metaphorical because there are different kinds of currency. Seeing yourself praised and lauded in the New York Times or simple fear of man, those are also kinds of currency. And so when the title was Shepherds for Sale, it obviously kind of covers a range of things. Again, very literal and figurative. Well, some of the complaints were, well, I'm included in this book. Are you saying that I took money under the table? And I'm like, no, I am not saying that about every single name in this book. And in fact, I took great pains in the introduction to say, I am not saying everyone here sort of knowingly made a bargain with the devil, but some people did. And so I cover both. I cover those who knowingly took money and partnered with secular left-wing billionaires in order to advance progressive causes in the church, and also those who I think were perhaps even unknowingly being worked on by those influencers and didn't realize it, but it was a way to advance their career prospects or simply to be liked. And so they too bought in. And so it's really just how on all of these topics, whether it's the LGBTQ agenda, open borders policies on immigration, CRT, which you brought up earlier, all of these things, basically, how did all of this get into the church? And that is what the book explores.
We've actually taken the book and we've talked about it several times about how it's kind of like a 3-act primer. If you really want to get an understanding to the current Christian worldview, and I know Stephen Wolf will shoot me for calling it Christian worldview, but we call it a Christian worldview. And that's what we want our listeners to have, is a solid one. We talk about fault lines being the grammar, and Voddie does a great job in his book with the grammar. You learn definitions. When you look and you see the sky is blue, what does blue mean? Those are the definitions you get from him. But from you got the real facts and argumentation. You got the form of what we're seeing in the church. Because when you look at a church and you say, ooh, what is that group they're donating to? Is that immigration stuff okay? You have those questions, but you cite it. And that's what's so beautiful. If people read Vody, they understand the issues that you're talking about that are creeping in, and then you cite it. And then Judd Saul's book's a fantastic third act. It closes it out and it shows the church, not only the Protestant church, but the church at large. And so together, there's a worldview that you guys are all speaking to. Do you think when you talk to people, is it getting through now at this point? Are they getting the message?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that is part of why some of the leadership who I critique in the book, why the reaction was so defensive, is because it has gotten through. And I think people kind of already knew it was a problem. What my book did was just explain to them, how did it become a problem? So I was already giving them an explanation for what they had already known they were experiencing. And maybe Voddie's was a little different in that he was trying to convince people, yes, we have a problem. And so thankfully I didn't have to do that uphill work. People already knew there was a problem by the time they got to my book. And I think the same thing with Judd's movie, Enemies Within the Church. I think it was 2021 when I saw Judd's movie. And, you know, at that point I had been an entertainment editor and culture editor for a long time. And I don't even remember how I happened to see it. Someone said, have you seen this? You should review this. And I went, well, that's interesting. And it just sort of resonated. Like what the premise of that film was, I went, I am seeing that in my own church and in my own workplace and school. I have seen what he's talking about. So I watched the movie and then I watched the reaction to the movie because I wrote a review and I didn't turn it in yet. I just watched the reaction, which was, how dare you? How dare you make this movie and make these claims? But they didn't refute the claims. And as a journalist, I sat there and went, no, hang on a minute. If he's wrong and these are false claims, then show that. But that's not what they did. What they did was just say, how dare you make this film at all? And to me, I'm like, that is not a good response. So I published my review. And I think that's how this all got started for me.
Yeah. Judd did a good work. It's been amazing. I think you and I both know Judd. When he was making that, got backed out of by so many people. As you were researching your book, did you have a lot of people back out on you?
Yes. So I had some people that had initially been willing to go on the record and then weren't willing to go on the record.
Really?
A lot of times what I would get was something like, I decided I don't want to be political, or I don't want to pull my church. If it was a pastor, I don't want to bring my church into a political fight. And that would be incredibly disappointing because generally what we were talking about in some of those subjects would be like they knew someone like Andy Stanley was shifting his position on gay marriage and they knew it and had been told it. And they weren't willing to go on the record then because literally I had a pastor tell me, I don't want to get political on this about gay marriage, which was really disappointing. So I had things like that. And I can't talk about it all, but I can tell you there was a lot of pressure behind the scenes to try to keep this book from being published. There was a lot of legal pressure brought to bear. There were a lot of backroom calls made. Some of these communications were shared with me. I mean, one, I will tell you, the National Association of Evangelicals made a call to another imprint at my publisher and said, we have great friends there. I'm paraphrasing, but we would hate for this to jeopardize friendships and trust. And can we just have a call with you and things like that? And what I can tell you is I didn't know it at the time, but as I look back, I go, every step of the way, I feel like God positioned me as a Christian writer and an evangelical mom to be outside of that system so that it couldn't touch me in a way that I wouldn't have appreciated, going in if I were consciously making decisions. The fact that I ended up at Daily Wire, which is conservative, but it's not Christian. It's a conservative secular media company, but that is very welcoming of my Christian views. And there's a lot of Christians who work there, but it's not a Christian organization. But because of that, when those backroom calls were being made, that pressure couldn't be brought to bear in the way it surely would have been if I had still been working for an evangelical media outlet. Same thing with my publisher. I had ended up at a conservative imprint at a secular publisher. And so when those calls started coming, they didn't really carry much weight.
Well, who do you think has given your book its fairest critique and the best reviews?
I've seen a number that I really liked. I thought Bethel McGrew did a great job in First Things. And, full disclosure, she's a friend. But she's a friend who, if you know her, suffers no attempt to dodge really sharp logic. So she was certainly, a tough interrogator in her own critiques. Yeah.
She's not invited to my Christmas party. I don't think she would be fun.
She's tough. She's a tough cookie, and so she had some criticism. but they were really fair. And I cannot remember what the outlet was, but there was actually a secular outlet that did a tremendous review. And it was because it was coming from people who weren't Christian and they got it. The manipulation of well, this is mean didn't really work, because it's not mean. If you read the book, it's really not. It's really just very straightforward. But they understood, like, well, yes, the people who are saying that are the people who are critiqued. And people often don't like books in which they are critiqued.
We were wondering, did you send a signed copy to the ERLC? Because I know everybody there needs to get one for Christmas. It's such a well-written source. I think all need to have a copy. I would be forced to sit down and read it and then take a test at the end of it, because so many people are still in denial about what you said. So I just want to say right here publicly, our listeners need to know, this is information that you have to get. You have to get it somewhere. This is a great source. I appreciate you bearing your soul in this book. The things you share personally are very good for us to hear, to see that you are a good Christian mama who loves her babies and your husband. And we thank you for the time putting into this and for the arrows you've taken for us. You took some blows for this. I'm not going to lie. You did a great job. You held your tongue when you needed to, and you stayed right on the truth. So I just want to say thank you and encourage our listeners. If you haven't read this book, you can't get around it. You need the resource, and you need to have your people in your churches listening to this, because what Megan's done here is a true asset for the church today.
Well, thank you. And thank you for recognizing some of my personal story in there. And I told that for a very specific reason. I'll just say it's the prodigal story in a feminine form. We'll put it that way. And I told it because I wanted people to know that this is not Kristen Dumez. This is not Tim Alberta. Some of this cottage industry of book, these deconstruction books that are attacking the church because they seem to want to destroy the church. This is a book about someone who was just pulled out of the worst pit by Christ and came to church and found sanctification there. And these are the ministries and the organizations and the local body that I want to protect. It's not because I want people to deconstruct and leave the church. I want her strong and healthy for, the next prodigal who comes along.
For our babies.
Well, and for our children.
Yeah. Yes.
And here's a question that I doubt you've ever been asked. I've got a copy of this that I want to take to church, and I want to put it in our church library, give it to the librarian, but I don't want my pastor to take it as this passive aggressive attack on him, Megan, because I think there's an elder at our church that listens to the show sometime. And Brother Bob, if you're listening to this, just please know that if I ever had a problem, we will be talking directly about it. There will be nothing passive aggressive. But how can people put this book in their church libraries? What do they need to write in the cover to make it okay?
Hopefully they have respect for people like Bodie Baucham, people like John MacArthur and Rosaria Butterfield and Os Guinness, and some of these other people who have said, no, you need to read this book. It's important to have this information. And in fact, one of the hit pieces that ran on the book was in the Dispatch. And I feel like I want to tell everybody, that they had sort of through a sleight of hand tried to act like I misquoted Os Guinness. I didn't. And then after the fact, after this hit piece ran, Os Guinness gave me a wonderful endorsement of the book. So, and that's the other thing I would tell people too, is if your pastor has heard something about it and is thinking, oh, I don't know what I think about this, also just encourage them to hopefully read some of my responses and read some of the positive responses from some of these other people.
All right, we're running out of time. What's your next project?
Ooh, okay. So I'm pitching a book right now. We'll see what happens. So don't hold me to this, but it is on the women's unhappiness epidemic and how leftism is causing it. It's tentatively titled Medicated, Miserable, and Alone, and What's Happening. And my mom, when I told her about it, went, why do you want everyone to hate you? But it's a real thing. I mean, when you look statistically, women are really unhappy right now, and they are increasingly isolated, and they're not having children. They're frequently not getting married. And I think we need to look at the causes of that and say, how have we gotten so far away from God's design for women and men, and how that's impacting women and making them incredibly unhappy?
That is a great subject. And you know what? You will have no shortage of friends with ideas for that book.
I know.
So you're going to have to say no, I think, a little bit.
Yeah.
That's great. So tell our listeners where they can get a copy of Shepherds for Sale and where they can hear you in the next few weeks.
You can find Shepherds for Sale at any book retailer, your Amazons, Walmarts, places like that. But if you would prefer smaller independent Christian bookstores, you can go to HarperCollins. Just search the book and HarperCollins page should come up, and it will link you to a whole bunch of options as well if you don't want to go with one of those big retailers. And you can always find me hanging around on Twitter/X at Meg Basham. I'm on Instagram at journalist Megan Basham. And multiple times a week, you'll find me reporting on Daily Wire's news podcast.
Well, that's going to do it for another episode of Faith in Action. We're thrilled to talk with you each week in Nashville, Memphis, Clarksville, and all over Tennessee as we talk about more ways to put your faith into action. Folks, if you want to hear more on this or other topics from a Christian worldview, head on over to botradionetwork.com and search for Faith in Action. There we have links to 5 years of past shows. You can listen to a wide range of guests sharing their wisdom about current events that affect Tennessee and the entire nation. And until next week, remember our favorite promise from the book of Exodus, the 15th chapter, verse 18, the Lord shall reign forever and ever.